And Misum for the invitation. I want to thank the previous speakers. That was truly inspirational. I really enjoyed that. Also want to thank the kind organizer, Elpida and Catherine. They have made me come here and organized everything to make sure I'm at this spot at this moment. And if it weren't for them, I have no idea where I would be. So thank you so much, Elpida and Catherine. That was great organizing. So what I'm going to do is try to deep dive into a little bit, or unpacking some of the things we already discussed. So Tim mentioned democracy, the panel discussed climate change and the possibility of a green transition. So what I'm going to do is dive into a particular instance, and that is Australia, since that's where I'm working. So I was going to look into a little bit of two crises. Democracy, as we see a crisis of representative democracy. People are turning away from democracy, less engaged. The institution seems to be hollowed out a bit, so a crisis. Another crisis is obviously climate change. And then there is an intersection here, I will argue. And there is a particular actor here that seems to be, engaging with both of these crises actively. So what Tim is suggesting, there is no global order. There is no single actor, but certain actors are more influential than others. So I'm going to argue that corporations and industry has a particular role to play here, and have had a role to play in the intersection of these two crises. So while I'm talking about Australia, I hope a few of these things, in fossil fuel especially, we can see how this would also play out in Canada, US. And while I'm talking about fossil fuel, we can also, I think it will resonate with some of the other industries you're seeing lobbying actively, but also engaging in a lot of social media or in media, in the public sphere, to turn the population in certain direction. So Tim has already spoke a little bit about that. Lars also spoke a little about that. That obviously there is a crisis here, an environmental crisis, a code red for humanity. And why we talk about the green transition here, it's not really happening. We want it to happen. We want it to be a green transition, but it's just an addition. With all these new energy sources we're seeing in wind and solar, and even the discussion of nuclear, if you like, these are just added on top of fossil fuel. So we're just seeing an addition of new energy sources. So while China phenomenally is doing really well with new renewables, they still open a coal mine every week. So this crisis is obviously really, really problematic. And there's no real major economies meeting the targets from Paris. And we saw Tim's fantastic slide there as well. So there was a few countries that looked pretty cool, like Sweden looked blue and doing pretty well. But a lot of that is also obviously shifting the dirty production to the global south, that if you look at that map is not doing so well. So you can see the tableauing of Europe, while Asia is still going up in emissions, and part of that is because we shifted it there in the global north. So there is probably a really hard issue to solve here. And another note is also, even if the whole map that Tim provided were all of these countries was following the Paris Agreement, we will still not achieve its goal. Because Paris Agreement is based on technologies that still doesn't really exist, or more than an experimental phase. So it's based on bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, for example, or direct air capture. All these things were assumed to now really be working, and it's not. So for example, the fossil fuel industry in the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act, they get millions of dollars to carbon capture and storage, and they do. They take the carbon, put it in the ground to get more oil or gas up. So that's the carbon capture storage, which is mostly happening now, is oil companies, gas companies put it out to expand and get more oil and gas. That's how it's used. I'm sorry, it sounds so negative. I don't know. I will try to be more positive eventually. I'm not sure, but I will do three. So even if you act on the Paris Agreement, I better move on. This is just too depressing. So now I'm going to go with another crisis. Wait, so that's the environmental crisis. Part of the problem, I think, is democracy. So I do think these crises are related, and that's at least how we started talking about democracy. Because I've been researching climate change for a long time, and the growing frustration with the lack of action made us turn more to politics and how the same industries we've been studying, how they engage with democracy. And this is another crisis. So if you look at global corruption indexes, for Europe, most people is turning away their trust from politicians. There's an absolute high level of mistrust for politicians. More than 50% don't trust the politicians in the country. There's another group that really comes through strongly, and I'm pointing at some of the students here. Business executives are almost as mistrusted as politicians, and so are bankers. So we have two groups here, business executives, bankers, and politicians who really are mistrusted. And one could argue that maybe this is not too strange. Maybe some of this mistrust has been created by those very businesses. And I will show how that could happen. We also have supranational organizations, and Dean did a good illustration of some of these. We had a discussion about that too. And I'm not against any of these organizations like World Bank or monetary funds and so on. They've obviously done good in calibrating interest. Also some bad, I guess, if you live in global south. But it takes democracy away from the citizens. So as soon as you have institutions and technocrats further away, oh, is democracy really for you as a citizen then? It's so far away. Well, I don't know what to do in EU. We have Brexit. And part of that is this mistrust for politicians that is far away from you. And this didn't obviously happen by chance, but I will return to that. Another thing is global corporations. We have a lot of corporations today that are bigger economically than most nations. And how they impact politics also create mistrust. I put a little note here, a little bullet point on the investor-state dispute settlement, which I think is a fantastic illustration of this. So say now, well, I can give you a real example to show how it happens. So Rockhopper is a UK oil drilling company. They had a permit to drill for oil 6 nautical miles outside Italy's coast. Italy, then responding to climate change, put in a policy suggesting you cannot drill within 12 nautical miles from the land. So we don't want oil rigs close to land because of previous accidents, climate change, and so on. Rockhopper sued Italy in one of these courts. They're often secret. There's no public hearings. They are organized privately by the company. No insight from the public. They won the settlement because you can sue not only for the exploration, because they explore this place, they haven't started drilling anything, but you can sue for future profits. So they got 190 million euros from Italy. The share price of Rockhopper doubled, and they took that money and went to Falkland Islands and drilled for oil there. And this is very hard for the public to take in, like, wait a second, what's going on here? What's this our say? We voted for this government, put these policies in place, and then a company can sue that government that we voted in for something we wanted. So these are some of this problem we're facing with these global corporations and the way we deal with trade at the global level. I will see some of this. We will argue, and many has argued in political scientists, that we now live in an audience democracy rather than a participatory party democracy in the sense of we as citizens, we see it play out. Oh, this is democracy. I hate that party. It's like you hating a football team or something. It's like you see the parties debating and you see a polarization and you're really not really participating because, you know, voting in most countries is going down. So you're not participating, you're watching it. And you're watching these technocrats, and you're watching these instances where politics is played out. But you feel quite alienated. And I think part of that is what we see in populism, authoritarianism, but also the protests we saw spiking. But how else can you give voice if you don't trust your politicians? What are you supposed to do? So what I'm going to do next is just dig in a little bit. And some of these slides can be a bit quote heavy. I'm sorry about it, but I just want to give you some flavor. And I think you're going to find them exciting enough that you don't mind too much about the large amount of text. And this is where I put this here, so I remember to thank my team, Chris and Vanessa, who have been working on for a long time, just making sure that they got the shout out they deserve. I'm not doing this alone. We're always a team to work on this. So what we did was we looked into the fossil fuel industries, coal and gas, mainly in Australia, and politics. So we interviewed 2 ex-prime ministers, state premiers, lobbyists, fossil fuel executives about this. How does it work? And we were lucky to get this kind of insight, and we were lucky to attain these kind of connections because we've been studying fossil fuel firms for a long time in Australia. So this wasn't too hard to get people to engage with us. For us to just understand, how does this happen? And what we will argue is that corporations and today don't pretend to act in their own interest. When the lobby in the political sphere talk to politicians, they pretend to talk in the interest of the nation. This is good for Australia. We all know it's not for us, it's for Australian people we do this. Similar, when they engage in the public sphere, they say, oh, they don't even say they are do this for Australia, they pretend to be citizens. And I'm going to give you some example how this happened. So normally when we think about political representation, we think that someone is represented. So I vote for you, which I would, and then you go and represent me. So you take my vote into account. And that is normally how representation is normally thought about. But it's not really how it plays out, because as we know, social movements, organizations, corporations, unelected people often speak for, populists always speak for the people. So they claim to represent the silent majority or the forgotten people or something like that, or the real Finns or the real Swedes or whatever they claim to represent. But this is not problematic only in the sense that they're not elected. I mean, no one elects corporations to be democratic. But because they also form the interest. So when we're born, we don't have a particular interest. These are formed in these debates. So in Australia then, when fossil fuels are so intensive engaging in the public sphere, they tell you what a real Australian should be interested in, how that identity should look like. So when then are coal industry, when you are really believing that you represent Australian people. So there's two things, 2 different spheres. So these are obviously overlapping. That's important to keep in mind here. The political sphere, where this political decision-making are made on behalf of the people, and the public sphere, where we as citizens are supposed to deliberate to form an opinion that we tell the government that this is what we want to do. So there's a deliberate action here. But also, in the public sphere, we're supposed to hold them to account. So if they don't do what we want, we can say, look, this is what we think as a population of this place. So then corporations engage in these 2 spheres. And as I said, they don't only engage for their own interest, they claim to represent the people. And that's slightly different. So it becomes a sort of, when they go to the politicians, it becomes like a surrogate representation. They actually don't represent the people because no one elected fossil fuel in this instance. They say they represent. It's a surrogate representative. They claim to carry that representation. And then suggest they act on behalf of the nation. So when they lobby, they're not claiming, if you put this policy into place, we will earn more money. They were claiming, if you put this policy into place, you will get more jobs to your region, there will be more economic other investment in this region. We're doing it not for us, we're doing it for the people. Then it also means that the citizen can't really participate in the same degree. So as a private citizen, I don't have that kind of access. So as one lobbyist said, it's like if the CEO of BHP want to talk to the Prime Minister, of course the Prime Minister is going to see him normally, always so far. And this is not strange. And as a state premier told us when we interviewed her, of course money gives you access. If someone gives me money for my political career, of course I'm going to see them. These are things we as private citizens rarely can do. In the US, politicians spend 30 to 70% of the time getting money. They hardly have time to engage in politics. And then, of course, it's not the same degrees in Sweden or even Australia. It just perhaps happens elsewhere, perhaps on the golf course, perhaps in network and so on. So studies suggest that just because you have less money involved in politics doesn't mean there is no lobbying or influence. So just to give you a little bit of flavor here how this happens. So we have an ex-Prime Minister of Australia suggesting this has been going on for some time. But the sad thing about this is the ex-Prime Minister of Australia acknowledged the limited capacity to act. You have arguably the highest position in Australia, except the king now. But still, you argue, look, I can't really do much because just like tobacco before, I'm completely constrained by these lobbyists. So how they operate, and he never denied that this had an effect. So you can see there highly paid lobbyist campaigns. You see that around the world. And there's a growing frustration after leaving office, like, was not that much I could do. And here's a lobbyist suggesting how this works. Oh, we come down to the minister, say, yada, yada, this is how I'm going to give you this type of money and jobs and so on and so on. Not to him, to sell to the public. So the Prime Minister then, or the Environment Minister, or the Resource Minister again then say, look, of course we should keep this open. It provides this amount of jobs. It provides this amount of resources to us. So this is, I guess, how it works in the political sphere. And that is obviously highly problematic because it excludes the citizens from this engagement. Rarely do we citizens have this kind of access. Another way to do this would be in the public sphere. And what we see here is that these companies, fossil fuel companies in Australia, engage not on behalf of themselves. It's not that they go out there and say, we want to have less environmental policies. That would be shooting itself in the foot. What they're saying, we are the people. And by doing this, they portray not themselves. It's not you ever see a coal miner in a coal mining cap with some coal smeared on the face. No, you always see other people, doctors, nurses, claiming to act or argue on behalf of Australians. And there's many ways to do this. One common way is advertorials. So if you look up a newspaper in Australia, a few pages, 3 or 4 pages, would be just key argument how great coal, or lately often gas, is for Australia. And there is no sign that this is the gas industry. So when you read the paper, it's very hard to distill, is this a journalist or is the gas industry? The problem is even worse. It wouldn't really matter. Because if you pay a 4-page advertorial, that newspaper is not going to argue against you. In Australia, we also have a particular problem where Murdoch, one single owner, in my state where I live, in Queensland, owns 13 of 14 newspapers. Murdoch is the majority newspaper in every capital city in Australia. And if you then have so much money flowing in from the industry, of course you're not going to argue against any of their policies. And this also flows into other newspapers. So, the financial reviews or Wall Street journals has been studying for over the last couple of decades. 50% of Wall Street journals, so-called reporting and journalism, is press releases, just reworded slightly. The other 50% now, perhaps AI. But we can see a lot of that is industry message. So it's hard then to have a public deliberation with other citizens when everything is caught up in this kind of industry policies. So there's very staged participation when the industry suggests we are the people. The argument is always we are the people. I'm going to show a couple of suggestions of how this could happen. So I have a senior advisor of Industry Association. So they argue here it's really quite hard to make that line. So on one hand, we want to write these op-eds. ExxonMobil did this really well in the early 2000s or late 90s or mid 90s, where they denied climate change, not as ExxonMobil, but as an opinion piece. And this is what they do. They write opinion pieces not on behalf of the company or on the industry, but on behalf of the citizen who looks as a journalist. But you can't go too far, so you often have to hide behind a particular people. another way to do that would be starting a Facebook group. Australians for Gas is a prominent Facebook group in Australia, where the different participants in that Facebook group throw out messages. Their audience is obviously not young people because they wouldn't use Facebook, but the same idea holds. So what they do is they engage in different debates as Australians for Gas. But the whole idea is funded by a gas company. So it's very hard then for citizens to deliberate. So how can we, as citizens, engage in deliberation with us and hold our politicians to account and tell our politicians what we want when everything is steered through these kind of industries? So this is highly problematic then for us as citizens to engage in the public sphere, which is so important to have a functioning democracy. So another way to do that is obviously further hiding behind behind people. So this is how they often use algorithm to then find people saying good things about the company, and then they promote that. So in this case, it's not BHP, which is a big mining company, saying it's good. It's the assistant principal of the Townsville State School who on the digital media, social media, all reading the Townsville Bulletin and saying beach good because it's good for me, my family, my community. So they operate behind algorithm and promote, engage in this deliberation. But this is obviously a staged deliberation because there's no citizen behind here, which is highly problematic. So if you then, as a country, try to act on climate change, or as citizens engage in deliberation on what kind of policies you want, it's really hard. On one hand, the politicians are basically the same people as the fossil fuel industry. In Australia, if you're a resource minister, you go straight back into, after your term, into board positions on at least 2 coal or gas companies. The last resource minister we had before this one, Matt Cavanagh, he even, when he resigned, thanked the coal industry for allowing him to represent them. He didn't thank his constituents or his citizens. He thanked the coal industry. Thank you for allowing me to represent you. And this is really hard then for citizens to say, oh yeah, we believe in our politicians. This democracy is really good for us. So you can see why there's such a skepticism in democracy. So, and this is I think my last slide. So, while I've perhaps portrayed a few examples of a particular industry, the fossil fuel industry in Australia, and obviously any environmental policy or climate change policy would be against their interests. So you can see why they would lobby so hard in doing this. But even when the industry or the company is someone I would agree with, it's problematic. So even when they promote somewhat progressive issues that I would support, it still undermines democracy because we can't hold them accountable. If you say, well, we don't have to buy their product, you're no longer talking about democracy. You're talking about the market. And these are not the same things, even though obviously they can work in parallel. So there's problematic here when corporations claim to represent the people, or because we cannot hold them to account. But also it's problematic because they form our interest. So when we don't know who's behind these messages, when we start agreeing with political positions, when we form our identities around particular industries, this is problematic for democracy. So what can we do? Well, there was in Tim's speech a while you can go up or you can down. And I'm always supporting from the bottom up. So increasing democracy is the only response to the lack of democracy. And we've seen it working, where normal people get together under right forms to deliberate, they come up with much better policies than most politicians. So Macron had this in 2019, 2020, where he had took 150 normal citizens from a range of different ages, interests, under particular boundary conditions of experts fact-checking them. They had a they had a discussion, deliberation, of what climate policies should we implement in France to lower our emission with 40%. The policies were amazing. They were spot on. They were putting in biodiversity, environment into the constitutions. If the flight is less than 4 hours, you should take the train, tax higher emitting vehicles, and so on and so forth. The problem was obviously that Macron didn't implement them. But we can see, as citizens together, we can come up with good responses. To increase democracy, having more political influence would also be great when we have extreme weather events, because then we're trained to deliberate, we're trained to compromise. So when something happens, we're trained to engage with our community to deal with the problems at hand. And the final thing, obviously, in terms of the public sphere, we saw early on when then Twitter actually had a democratic purpose, actually shared good information. I mean, we saw the Arab Spring and the importance of Twitter in many of these instances. Now, obviously, you will hardly trust it as a democratic source. But what are the e-platforms? What are the type of democracies we can engage with for much more direct policy influence, more direct measurement of policies? So I hope those two things in the end gave some positivity towards all the negative at the beginning. Thank you so much.